Page 9.
Yeah. After he said, "That will make sense, man," you ask him a question, and then at the bottom he gives you an answer, and he starts out with, "I have to look at the video again. But yeah, I think I'm trying to stay on my right side of the road because I'm quote unquote freaked out now." Do you remember that?
I do. This question is only in relation to where in the road he is with his vehicle. So his being able to determine exactly whether he was all the way to the left, all the way to the right, into the center, needing to see the video for that kind of detail is not really relevant at this point.
Because at this point in the investigation, that's not really what you're focused on.
The detail of exactly where he was in the middle of the road was not a focus of the investigation.
And you don't know whether that's become a focus 17 months later, 15 months later, because you're a witness.
As a member of the investigative team, in our discussions, I know that where exactly he was on the road at the time he took the video is not an investigative important question.
Okay. And again, directing your attention down to hold on, I'm not ready to go there yet. And again, on page 8, your question to him is, it was either here or up here, but you remember something about traction. You remember asking that question?
Yes, sir, I do.
Because while in some respects you've told the jury that details aren't important, this detail matters to you, doesn't it?
Only to the extent that I'm trying to get him to provide the most information that he can from his memory. This question only refers to the point where he does the three-point turn in the reenactment that we showed where he comes back out. There was 2 areas that it most likely occurred in, and that's all we were trying to determine.
Okay. Well, in the practice run, in the dress rehearsal for this, you were suggesting to Mr. Bryan that he had driven to the top of the street before turning around. You don't recall that?
No, sir.
Because that would affect how fast Mr. Bryan had to be traveling, wouldn't it?
I don't know.
Well, you know the length of the video, right?
Yes, sir, I do.
So if you can figure out where the video starts and where it stops and the number of seconds that elapse, you can get some idea of how fast things are happening. Am I correct?
I could, but if I was directing Mr. Bryan on what to do, I would have directed them to go all the way to the end of the road before we did a turnaround in the reenactment. But his memory was that he did not go down that far, and he was trying to determine which area he pulled into to do the turnaround prior to going to the end of the road.
Well, you'd agree it'd be a whole lot easier to figure out how much leading is going on here and how much direction and how much uncertainty there is if we had recorded the dress rehearsal as well.
No, sir.
Now, you asked Mr. Bryan again about a black mailbox on page 9.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Because the black mailbox matters to you.
The black mailbox is simply a reference point during the video of when he picks the phone back up, as I indicated while we watched the reenactment video.
And Mr. Bryan again indicates to you that he really doesn't recall.
That's
He's
correct.
not in the top 40% of page 9?
Yes, sir. He states that will make sense.
And then on page 10, you're directing Mr. Roddy to tell you where he thinks he stopped. prior to the shooting?
Are you talking about the second line?
Yeah. Are we where you stopped and parked? Are you closer?
That's not direction, that's a question. It starts with, are we? I'm asking Mr. Bryan where he thinks he is, or if we are at the location where he stopped.
And Mr. Bryan tells you, I think I'm going to be a little closer.
He actually starts off and confirms and says, yeah, and then says, I think I'm going to be a little bit closer. I think when we left the scene, I backed into the driveway.
Okay. So he's telling you he's even closer to the shooter.
I'm sorry?
So he told you he was closer to the shooter, or probably closer to the shooter.
From where we were at the point in the drive-through, he was saying he was a little bit closer than where I had initially stopped and asked him that question.
And that's because Mr. Bryan is trying to minimize his involvement in this case. He's trying to distance himself from the shooting when he tells you that he's probably closer.
Mr. Bryan's involvement or minimization in the shooting has nothing to do with where he is at the time he stops and finishes recording. His minimization had occurred earlier in the process of chasing Mr. Arbery out of his driveway.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. And then you say this is, quote unquote, kind of where you take that final video of the shots.
That's correct.
And he says, I'd say, quote unquote, probably about right there.
After he directed me by saying, I'd say a tad more up front, indicating for me to pull forward a little bit. And then he says, I'd say probably be right about there.
Okay. And then Roddy says at the bottom of page 10, quote unquote, I'm guessing here, man.
That's correct.
And again on page 11, again on where he is, Mr. Bryan tells you, I don't know. I don't recall exactly, but I want to say not until I stopped. I'm sorry. When you ask him about when he first saw the gun, when he first saw a firearm, what does he tell you?
I don't know. I don't recall exactly, but I want to say not until I stopped.
All right. Hopefully no more transcripts this morning. Okay. My next question is this. Regardless of what Roddy Bryan told you or said to anybody else in the months before, we know that Mr. Bryan walked to his garage to get his keys, don't we?
I don't recall the video specifically. He didn't run, but if it was walk, it was a quick walk.
Okay, because you can count the number of seconds on the video, all right?
You could.
Okay, and when you do that, he's obviously not running.
I'd agree.
Okay, so if he told somebody he was running, that would have been incorrect.
I agree.
Okay. And we know that Mr. Bryan, whatever he may have said to someone over the months before, we know from the night out video that he walked to his truck.
That's correct.
Now, and let me be clear, you've reviewed the night hour video. I mean, I know that, but I have to ask.
Yes, sir, I have.
Okay. However, Mr. Roddy described the position of his truck in his driveway over the course of many interviews and over several months. Whether he said straight or to the left or towards the right, we know from the night owl video that he's angled, your word, not mine, for lack of a better word, to the right and away from Mr. Arbery as Mr. Arbery is coming back to his house.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to any testimony about the night owl video's contents because the video itself will be the best evidence of that, and that video will come out in the evidence.
That's fine. Okay, go ahead.
But some things are clear in this case from your investigation. As Mr. Arbery passed Mr. Bryan's house, did Mr. Bryan tell you that Mr. Arbery called out to him, please call 911, there are crazy people after me?
No, sir.
Roddy, Bryan told you that Mr. Arbery never said a word.
That's correct.
I believe Roddy Bryan told you that he never saw Mr. Arbery's lips moving.
I don't remember those words exactly, but he did say that Mr. Arbery never said anything during the entire incident.
Well, going back to your May 13th statement, although Mr. Bryan has said in various contexts that he heard the person in the truck speaking, when you interviewed him, it was clear that Mr. Bryan was really reading lips at that point.
I don't recall that.
You don't recall him talking about the driver of the truck's lips moving?
Not offhand, no, sir.
And he couldn't see Mr. Arbery's lips moving because Mr. Arbery's face was not directed towards him. You don't remember any of that?
Is that a question?
That was a question.
I don't remember speaking specifically as to whether or not he could see Mr. Arbery's face to see his lips moving or not.
Okay. Now, I believe you've, did Mr. Bryan report Mr. Arbery as he's passing in front of his home making any gestures toward him? Like, help?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, Mr. Bryan is out on his front porch at this point, right?
That's correct.
And music is playing.
Yes, sir.
And the closer Mr. Bryan gets to the garage, the louder that music gets.
I would say that's believable. Yes, sir.
Because that's where he told you the music was coming from.
Yes, sir.
Okay. His garage door is open.
That's correct.
Okay. And his driveway is parked out in the front on the driveway, right?
His truck?
Yeah.
That's correct.
What, if anything, had Roddie Bryan done at this point to convey to Mr. Arbery any hostile intent?
I don't know that Mr. Arbery would have even seen Mr. Bryan at this point.
Well, we can speculate as to what he saw or didn't see. But what I'm saying is, from the person vantage point of Mr. Arbery on the street, there's a white dude working on his front porch with the car in front and the garage door open and music playing, right?
That's correct.
Is there anything else about that scene to suggest that Mr. Bryan bears any ill will or hostile intent towards this gentleman?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, I'm trying to figure out who's jumping to assumptions here. It feels like from the statement you obtained from Mr. Bryan that it's Mr. Arbery who's assuming the worst about Mr. Bryan.
And I'm going to object to that, Judge, as speculation.
I'll rephrase.
Good question out there, please.
What, if anything, from the point where Mr. Arbery comes to his front yard, passing one set of bushes, crossing across the driveway and out of view to the other set of bushes, in that time frame, which is on the Night Owl video, but as to which you've interviewed Mr. Bryan, what, if anything, does Mr. Bryan do? What, if anything, does Mr. Bryan say? What, if anything, does that picture suggest to Mr. Arbery that he could not seek help?
In Mr. Bryan's statement, he actually says that he hollers out to the truck, y'all got him or you need help. So to me, that would indicate, and he indicates that he is speaking to the truck. So that to me would indicate that he was not there to help Mr. Arbery.
And he's also indicated to you that it was obvious from the circumstances that nobody could hear him.
We don't know that. He thinks that nobody could hear him because his music was playing. But you're asking me, what would have Mr. Arbery have seen from the road? Now, we don't know what Mr. Arbery would have heard, but needless to say, his words were directed to the truck as, do y'all have them or do you need any help?
Okay. Do you recall from your interview with Mr. Bryan ever saying that Arbery asked him to call 911?
No, sir.
from Mr. Bryan's perspective, the events of February 23rd are, for a lack of a better term, chaotic. Would you not agree?
Objection, speculation about Mr. Bryan's perspective, Your Honor.
Well, you asked Mr. Bryan what he was doing that day and what he knew. Am I correct?
I did.
And Mr. Bryan indicated to you he wasn't in communication with anyone that day.
That's correct.
Specifically, he wasn't in communication with Matthew Albenzi.
That's correct.
He doesn't know anything about Matthew Albenzi, does he?
That's correct.
He can't because Mr. Albenzi is well up the street.
That's correct.
Okay. And you reviewed Mr. Bryan's cell phone records. You reviewed his social media. At this point, you probably know more. You may know Mr. Bryan better than Mr. Bryan knows himself. Fair enough?
I don't know if I'd go that far, but
Mr. Bryan is not in communication with anyone prior to the shooting.
that's correct.
He doesn't know whether Mr. Albenzi is armed.
I don't know that I ever asked about Mr. Albenzi and what Mr. Bryan knew about him.
And Mr. Bryan doesn't know that the McMichaels are armed until moments before the shooting. That's what he told me.
That's correct.
Matter of fact, Mr. Bryan doesn't even remember seeing Gregory McMichael until after the shooting, when you can see him clearly on the video in the back of the truck.
That's correct.
And Mr. Bryan's told you that several minutes elapsed before the police arrived on the scene, when we know that, in fact, it was probably a matter of seconds.
That's correct.
Mr. Bryan has told you at times that he feels like he's alone out there with Mr. Arbery.
Yes, sir. After he cuts him off, tries to block him in, he says he realizes he's with him by himself.
Okay. And when he's quote unquote cornering Mr. Arbery, he's doing that by himself.
That's correct.
And even after Mr. Bryan gets so many facts about this case wrong, facts that we can actually see on the video, you're still surprised that he struggles to recall minute details months later?
I don't think Mr. Bryan got a lot of facts incorrect. I think the general facts of the case, he was correct in his recollections. What he was incorrect on or unsure about were what I would call minor details, like I said, positioning of the road and that sort of thing. Now, if we're talking about Mr. Gregory McMichael and his remembrance of him in the truck, it's not uncommon for witnesses in traumatic events or people that see traumatic events to somehow get what's called tunnel vision, and they might miss certain aspects of an event. That's why anybody that sees any type of traumatic event, if it's multiple people, you can ask them, and they'll all see something a little bit different. And that's how I would explain Mr. Bryan's recollection.
And Mr. Bryan's basically related to you without using the words that this was a traumatic event for him.
It was.
And you can hear in his breathing the fear during this encounter.
I don't recall hearing his breathing.
How many times have you listened to this video?
More times than I'd like to remember.
You and me both, but you don't recall that.
No, sir.